Welcome everyone back to another Saturday webinar. Again, these Saturday webinars are made possible by the Ashbrook Center, which is an independent center at Ashland University offering a number of resources to help teachers teach young citizens what it means to be Americans. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach political science and history. I'm also co-chair of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. And I'm happy to be back and joined by two very thoughtful historians today. Talking about Franklin Roosevelt through Depression and War as part of our webinar series this year, Presidents and Their Times. So if you happen to be joining us for the first time, the purpose of this is just to have an interesting conversation among thoughtful scholars on an interesting president. And we invite all of you joining us today to please jump into that conversation by submitting questions in the chat feature. We've got several good questions already that have been submitted, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Those are really good questions. As always, we draw on documents from our database of documents at teachingamericanhistory.org, which you can access online by simply typing in tah.org. We've shortened it for you so it's easy to get to it. I should also mention that those of you joining us will get an email in the next week or so with a link that you can click on to request a certificate of participation. Let me introduce our panelists. Happy to have David Krugler here, who's professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. He's published a number of books on several different topics, ranging from Cold War propaganda, nuclear warfare, and racial conflict in the United States. And David, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think your most recent book is 1919, The Year of Racial Violence: How African Americans Fought Back, which was published by Cambridge Press a year or two ago.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, great book.
Thanks, Chris.
We're happy to have David teach in our master's program here. He teaches a number of courses ranging from the Cold War to World War II and American foreign policy, the American way of war. So he's a staple of our program, and happy to have you here today, David.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
And our next panelist is also a staple of our master's program, Stephen Tootle, professor of history at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California. His reviews, articles, and essays have appeared in the Claremont Review of Books, the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, the History News Network, and of course his hometown newspaper, which is always a good thing to contribute to. And Stephen recently concluded a term as a leadership fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. In our master's program, he's taught, again, a wide range of courses. He taught a text course on John Steinbeck not long ago. He's taught on Civil War and Reconstruction, America during the Cold War, and also a course on the 1960s, which I heard was very, very interesting. And I wish I had had time to sit in on that. But thanks to both of you for being with us today, talking about Franklin Roosevelt. So we have an hour or so of a conversation, and we're supposed to talk about one of the most important presidents of all time, somebody whose impact on the presidency cannot be covered in an hour. So I'm just going to go right for the jugular and throw out a big question that either of you can jump in and start with, or you can ignore and go with any of the questions that people have submitted. But as historians, what do you think is the most controversial aspect of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency? Or maybe you could do it. Maybe you can answer one of two things or both. What is the most? What aspect of Roosevelt's presidency has had the most lasting influence on the presidency? And which aspect do you as historians find most controversial?
Boy. Take that. David, you want to go first?
I have a couple thoughts on that. It's a great question. I think the answer to both questions can be tied together. Roosevelt's most lasting influence, if we want to say it most simply and most to the point, is that the use of federal power is a welcome and positive action, and that the use of state power to provide for the well-being of citizens is an obligation of the state and something to be welcomed by the people. And I think that has proved to be one of the most controversial legacies of the Roosevelt presidency. Of course, we're talking about the longest presidency in U.S. history, and unless the U.S. Constitution is amended, it will stand forever as the longest presidency. One only has to make the briefest of surveys of the current race for the presidency on all sides to see why Roosevelt's legacy of the use of federal power for the well-being of its citizens is controversial. I think specifically debates over the Affordable Health Care Act of Obamacare show that. I mean, that is a legacy of Roosevelt's governing ideology and his accomplishments.
Yeah, and this is all seeming so familiar to me. It's now my turn to say something to agree with David in a slightly dumber way, which is my role. Yeah, I have very close to the same thoughts. Put in a slightly different way, I would have just said the growth of the administrative state in terms of just the structural change, and for all the reasons that Professor Krugler said. And the long-term influence, the way I put it sometimes to my students is now every sparrow that falls from the sky, we expect a response from our national daddy, which is, there are very few things that can happen in American society anymore where we don't turn to the president and expect some sort of response as just sort of an expectation. And this would have been bizarre to Americans in the 19th century, this idea that the president had to weigh in on every issue and have beers with people. As far as the most controversial, I guess same sort of angle, slightly different take on it. I think right now I'd stick with the economic success or failure of the New Deal, which is sort of wrongfully controversial. It shouldn't be controversial. The New Deal was an economic failure if the goal of it was to cause the economy to recover. But for some reason, people think that it was this huge success. But I have a new sort of half a thought, and this is one of these things that I'm sure this happens to David all the time, but you see some trend in American politics, and maybe it's something that's been emerging for the past 20 years, and it just sort of explodes. I wonder if the FDR's response to his populist challengers might become more important as time goes on, simply as kind of because we're seeing the emergence of these populist challengers in American politics now in a lot of different, from both the Republicans and the Democrats. I'd call that a half thought right now, because I would want to see what happens over the next 20 years or so.
Stephen, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just on that thought, if you don't mind. So can you just clarify for me where you see the sort of roots of populist thought in Roosevelt? And I mean, in what sense would you say he influenced that, the resurgence of that?
Well, it hit me the other day. I was thinking I was teaching something completely on a different track, but I was talking about the Democratic Party repealing the 2/3 rule, which happened in 1936. And I was teaching about racial matters, why this was important in terms of race. But it was a tipping point in the Democratic Party also, because it meant that for many years, I feel like it was fair to describe the overall philosophy of the Democratic Party as majoritarianism at the local level, right? That's how I always summarize it. And 1936, I feel like that's the year when it became solidified as majoritarianism at the national level. Does that make sense? And then we start to see evidence of it in sort of 48 and 50, and by 52, it's just sort of game on. and has been that way for the last 50 years. So,
I see.
and he was doing that. It wasn't in response to the racial stuff. It was in response to the rise of people like Huey Long. So he wanted to make sure that he didn't need to have 2/3, and because it's we always think of his reelection as being a total slam dunk, but those challengers were very real.
Yeah.
Looking forward, he considered them a real threat.
Yeah. That's a great point. Those are great. And you raise other questions, of course, or at least the way both of you were talking about this make me think of other questions. I'd like your thoughts on the elections, all four of them, or maybe pick the most interesting one at some point. But can I just step back first before we do that? Maybe a bigger question, since both of you answered on the question of the most significant aspect of Roosevelt's presidency is his influence on the increased power of the state or the growth of the administrative state. So I guess this is a hard question to answer again, the short amount of time that we have, but how does this happen? So you've had, a number of attempts to explain Roosevelt and his presidency. One is it's the circumstances of the Great Depression that just sort of usher in Roosevelt as a kind of repudiation of Hoover. Roosevelt kind of brings a new twist on things, and with it, he's got this group of thinkers with him that bring a kind of energy for change with them. But then you've got the personality aspect of Roosevelt. So I'm not asking the question very clearly, but would you say that the election in 32 of Roosevelt is just a kind of perfect storm for him that allows him to, maybe for the first time as a president, openly call for these massive increases in the growth of the state? And I guess my underlying question is, how do the American people go along with that? Why do they go along with that?
You want to take the first pass, Dave?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, that's a great problem to pose, Chris. And we did get a question from one of the participants about whether or not 32 was an acceptance of FDR's governing philosophy and his proposals, or a repudiation of Herbert Hoover. I think the best answer to that question is yes, it was both a repudiation and an acceptance of Roosevelt's principles. But in the 32 campaign, Roosevelt brilliantly avoided specifics and focused on mood and a restoration of confidence in the American people. Now, in outlining the New Deal in 32, and we should keep in mind these campaigns were so much shorter than they are today. I mean, Roosevelt's not even the nominee until the summer of 32. And even as late as September, as we see in the Commonwealth speech, he's providing some specifics and really providing us with profound and very important information about what he's going to do. That's what, 6 weeks out from the vote. So we have a very attenuated campaign. But Roosevelt talks about bold, persistent experimentation, and that's a quote. He said, we're bold, persistent experimentation. And I think coupled with his ceaseless optimism that this is not the end of America, this is not an endless depression, that with the right approach and the right people and the right amount of energy and effort, the Great Depression can be ended. And I think a majority of Americans voting in 32 liked enough of that message to give Roosevelt a chance without knowing a lot of specifics. Roosevelt's not explaining exactly what he's going to do about banking. He flags this in the first inaugural address, but he doesn't give a lot of specifics. And this proved so frustrating to Hoover that there is a fascinating exchange of letters in the very long interim during the lame duck period for Hoover. In 33, the inauguration still did not occur until March. So we go from early November to early March. And Hoover wrote a letter to Roosevelt and said, look, I think it would really help the mood of the country if they heard from you about what you want to do. And not only did Roosevelt not respond to that first letter, but when Hoover followed up with a somewhat testy second letter, Roosevelt blamed the lack of response on one of his assistants, said I never got it, and then just simply thanked Hoover for his input, and that increased the already dislike Hoover had for Roosevelt even before Roosevelt sworn in. But here we see Roosevelt, not giving a lot of specifics, and so, to come back to the question asked, yeah, a lot of it's repudiation, but I think people liked what they heard about Roosevelt's mood and his basic message of optimism, and we're going to experiment boldly, and if it fails, we'll try something else.
That's really interesting. Can I just follow up with another question, David?
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. So you're describing Roosevelt's campaign as one of optimism. And I guess a lot of us today, of course, are used to the sort of campaigning against somebody else, right? And you're portraying how your opponents in a race have the wrong ideas about things. Was that present in Roosevelt's campaign as well? Was he running negatively? Was he running against Hoover, or was he simply putting out that positive, vague, albeit but positive message of hope? Was there much of that in these campaigns? I'm not sure, actually.
From what I've read, there was not a lot on Roosevelt's part directly targeting Hoover. And I think the Commonwealth speech that was part of our document selection shows that. If I remember correctly, Roosevelt never mentions Hoover once. Now, if you look at Hoover's October 31st, 1932 campaign speech at the Madison Square Garden in New York, it's all about Roosevelt. It's all about the dangers of the New Deal. It's a proposal to alter our very foundations, and not in a good way, Hoover says. So Hoover takes that approach, but maybe Stephen can pitch in here too if Roosevelt does as well. But I just don't recall seeing significant campaign presentations or speeches that go after Hoover. I think Roosevelt and his advisors believed the less said about Hoover, the better, because his approval rating was so low in the country.
Yeah, I agree that the Hoover was the election was a foregone conclusion. The nomination for the Democratic nomination was to select who would be the next president. So let me see if I can tie together a lot of the stuff that people brought up. First, as far as the mood of the country, I think it's difficult to overstate the mood of emergency of that time. And you had people like Walter Lippmann, whose previous criticism of progressivism had always been that, oh, you're going too far. You need to be more reserved and cautious. And his advice to FDR on the eve of his election was, you may have to assume dictatorial powers, Franklin. In other words, it was not an unreasonable assumption that FDR would come in and essentially act as a dictator. And that was advice he was getting. So I think it's more important. And as much as I am a critic of Franklin Roosevelt's policies and some of the forces he's unleashed, I always rank him as our third most important president. And for really two reasons: World War II, obviously, but the other thing is another argument made by this historian Alonzo Hamby in this book called "For the Survival of Democracy," which is a kind of comparative economic history and political history of the United States in the Depression, and then what was going on in the rest of the world. And this was the time in American history when we could have had a dictator. Democracy could have gone away, and that certainly did happen in other places. The other, as far as the reasons why it didn't, I always look to these. There's a nice old book by this historian named Jeffrey Herf called Reactionary Modernism. It was about Germany, and I always found this argument really compelling that he makes that when modernity hits in Germany, the political institutions are not sort of formed enough to handle the forces of modernity as they come crashing down. And the Depression to me, always represented this sort of perfect storm of you have modernity, this force in human history that by the time of the Depression had been circulating and churning for 30 or 40 years, and then you just have this economic calamity. And you can have intellectuals in the 1920s discussing, the meaning of industrialism in a sort of fun way. But if you really feel like you have no control over your life, that the world is just sort of spinning out of control because of industrialization, but the economy is good, you can sort of have a little bit of confidence about the future. But when the Depression hits, there's no answer. There doesn't seem to be an answer. So I think the important thing for the American people in 1932 is not so much that the stuff like the Commonwealth Club Address, which I was the one who suggested it for a different reason, but your average person, they didn't read or understand the Commonwealth Address. What they wanted from Franklin Roosevelt was just do something, right? As you said, bold, persistent experimentation. Try something. If it doesn't work, admit it frankly. Try something else. And to the extent it's a repudiation of Hoover, or as one person asked, the influence of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is somebody who made suggestions to FDR that he sort of rejected. And it's only later, after the World War II spending, that people sort of retroactively go back and say, oh, Keynes was really influential. That he wasn't influential on FDR. I think the Commonwealth Club Address shows how FDR was drawing from the American past and his understanding of economics, which is flawed. I'd say wrong, crazy, maybe, but it wasn't Keynesian. It only looked Keynesian in retrospect.
I'll just add on quickly to what Stephen said, put a little specific detail in there. Roosevelt was urged to deficit spend when Social Security collections kicked in, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. And you've got the Roosevelt recession of 37 then, and if he had been fully or even partially a Keynesian, I think he would have agreed to deficit spending for more public works to offset Social Security payroll deductions and some other factors that were serving to slow what was already a very gradual recovery, or very snail pace recovery.
Yeah, I mean, think about, David, I mean, you're so right. I mean, you think about what Social Security payroll deductions in a barely recovering economy did. It just sucked all that money right out of the economy at precisely the wrong time. You're exactly right. This is a perfect repudiation of Keynes. If he had any understanding of Keynes or cared about him at all, he would have never done something like that. That's an excellent example.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So Roosevelt's plan to deal with the Depression then wasn't so much deficit spending as you're pointing out. When we talk about the New Deal, I know sometimes we talk about the first New Deal and the second New Deal. It seems like the second New Deal has more to do with the Social Security aspects. What was the initial idea behind the New Deal? How was that supposed to help deal with the problems of the Great Depression?
Roosevelt uses a word twice in these documents, separated by more than 10 years. In the Commonwealth Address, he talks about interdependence. And in his 1944 State of the Union speech, he uses that word again. This is the key to Roosevelt's governing philosophy, that in a modern society, as Stephen noted very astutely, there are unique challenges that we must adapt to meet. And you see in that Commonwealth Address, Roosevelt bring up Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis about the frontier, that up until the late 19th century, the frontier presented opportunities. It forged American democracy. It helped ease some of the social pressures developing in the age of industrialization, but it's no longer gone. And I think Roosevelt is hinting in that speech that we've now reached a point in the 20th century where we have to take drastic measures. And he emphasizes his desire to work within the limits of the Constitution as a chief executive, but also makes it clear that if Congress won't act, he will act. And he does this in his first inaugural address. And with this notion of interdependence, addressing the banking problem is one way to do that. A historian by the name of Barton Bernstein argued decades ago that Roosevelt had the opportunity to nationalize the U.S. banking system. He didn't want to do it. He was not so inclined. And so he actually saved it. So Bernstein entitles his analysis "The Conservative Achievements of Liberal Reform." But I think this shows Roosevelt's sense of interdependence, that we need to recognize that the banks and those who get very wealthy from the financial system are dependent on small depositors, and small depositors are dependent on banks to not just cash checks and have cash, but to get loans and buy homes. And if we don't have a stable banking system, everybody suffers. Some will suffer more and longer right away than others. Think of a bank failure without any sort of deposit insurance. But it will drag us all down. So it's the job of the federal government to arbitrate these interests and find the points of cooperation and manage them in ways that they serve one another, while restraining abuses or lessening opportunities for someone to take advantage and collapse the system.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important. You mentioned the sort of first New Deal, second New Deal, and then some historians even think they detect a third New Deal in there somewhere. But the Commonwealth Club Address, one of the reasons why I like it is it's what he intended to do before he took office. It's an explanation of his underlying assumptions, and the conditions can change, but I always think it's important. That's why I always have my students read, inaugural addresses, because I want to know what the president said he was going to do, and not let's judge him by that. And then for me, the Commonwealth Address it kind of does the same thing, and I think it is fantastic because it explains a couple of things about American history that show how American history had sort of been going on a specific trajectory for a while, but there were almost like this during the Civil War, these competing narratives of the meaning of American history that were running in parallel to one another. And what FDR is trying to do is to blend them into a new narrative. And I'll try and be a little more specific here a second. So there are just a couple of lines that I always point out in the Commonwealth Address, and if you have it in front of you or whatever, you can refer to it. But when he quotes Jefferson, his specific understanding of Jefferson, I always say is actually really good, because I always think that people misunderstand Jefferson, but I think one person who didn't was FDR. And it's in this one line. He says, "Government to him was the means to an end, not an end in itself." And I always say, if there's one sentence that describes the sort of logic of liberalism in the 20th century after it's defined by FDR, it's this: that government needs to exist in order to be a means to an end, and that government is capable of providing that end. In other words, there's this older assumption that says, government doesn't exist to provide a means to an end. I mean, but what FDR was looking at in Jefferson is saying, no, Jefferson was trying to create an agrarian America. That was his vision of, what America should be. Now, what we're going to do in the middle of in the middle of this depression is we now have a vision of what America should be. Government is going to be the vehicle to achieving that goal, and that goal is achievable. Whereas the argument of, let's say, the other side, the older sort of Republican argument, was that government is not an end in itself. It's a method of living your individual. It's something that allows you to live your individual life. If you go back and read, the things that FDR didn't like about Theodore Roosevelt was every time Theodore Roosevelt used the phrase equality, he always put of opportunity. And you'll see in the Commonwealth Club address, FDR says, no, we need to start talking about equality of condition, right? We need to start discussing two kinds of rights. Of course, to any Republican or progressive or conservative, you sort of scratch your head. Two kinds of rights. What are you talking about? There's just rights, and we have this one understanding of what rights are and what the role of government is in a pluralistic society, balancing these rights. And FDR says, no, there are two kinds of rights, and that's what David was talking about, is sort of these rights that are associated with social responsibility. This is where we hear echoes of FDR in people like Elizabeth Warren, or Barack Obama. You didn't build that, right? What about the firemen and who deliver the public services and the roads, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I would mention is the underlying economic assumptions of FDR during the Depression were just I don't know if it's the right word, Manichaean. It was you see in the Commonwealth Club address, he says that our industrial capacity is overbuilt. And I don't know if you guys know who Terry Crews is. No, he's a it's a terrible example, but I heard him once. Those of you who know who Terry Crews is are all laughing right now because he's like an actor and he was a former football player. But I heard him once on a radio show discuss why he hated the theme song for the Jeffersons. And I thought, wow, Terry Crews understands something that Franklin Roosevelt doesn't understand. He said, Terry Crews, Google him and look at a picture of him and you'll know why this is funny. Terry Crews says, I always hated the theme song of the Jeffersons because it was talking about getting a piece of the pie. And he says, the world is a kitchen. You can make your own pie. And that's what FDR didn't understand. He was talking about how resources are limited and the industrial capacity is overbuilt. And he said, now this is the era of administrative management of these limited resources. It's going to be enlightened, right? It's going to be government intervention to manage these limited resources. Of course, it's all wrong, but that was how he assumed the world worked.
Yeah, he actually, even in the Commonwealth Club address, he actually says in that paragraph where we're reappraising our values, he says, the task of government now is the administering resources and plants already in hand, meeting the problem of underconsumption, of adjusting production to consumption.
Yeah.
Which means reducing production, right?
It just means he doesn't understand price. Right. He doesn't.
But distributing wealth and products more equitably.
Right.
That, to me, is the key line, right?
Yeah. It's all there, right? I mean, he lays it out.
With the Day of Enlightened Administration being here, right?
The Day of Enlightenment, of course. Yeah. So bow down, right?
But you can see that at the beginning of the speech, Stephen, where you started us, where he's quoting Jefferson, where you mentioned his treatment of Jefferson's claim that government is a means to an end, but not an end in itself. But the quote from Jefferson is really revealing, right? Where he's saying, Jefferson observing how there's this sort of great mediocrity of wealth. There are very few rich, and even the rich are of moderate wealth, right? We have no paupers. The mass of our population is laborers. That's a kind of vision of an economic society that I think is very clearly Roosevelt's. And that's I think very revealing of that goal or that vision that you were saying government ought to be a means to, right? And that's the end.
Right.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, by the way, I guess I should preface this by saying no historians agree with me, or at least I've ever. But I think people really get Jefferson wrong. I think Franklin Roosevelt gets Jefferson right. I think it's one of the few things he gets right is I think he correctly identifies how it is Jefferson that is the predecessor of Jackson. It's anyway, I don't want to go too far down that road. But
I'm sorry, you made me think of something interesting, because in the paragraph before he talks about Jefferson, he's talking about Hamilton. And I think he gets Hamilton mostly right, personally. But where he seems to be praising Jefferson or saying we need to live up to Jefferson, he seems to be very critical of Hamilton because
Right.
he's not democratic. But and he describes him as Hamilton was one who where's this brilliant, impatient of slow-moving methods. Fundamentally, Hamilton believed that the safety of the republic lay in the autocratic strength of its government. That fundamentally a great and strong group of central institutions guided by a small group of able and public-spirited citizens could best direct all of government. So it sounds like he's being critical of Hamilton, but you have to wonder in light of some of the things you and David had said earlier about his sort of bordering on dictatorship, as revealed in his first inaugural, whether he doesn't agree with that sort of mode of government as the best way to bring about this end or this vision of an equitable society. But I always find that ironic. So insofar as, I'll stop in a second, but insofar as one of you mentioned earlier, Roosevelt, in laying out this sort of historical account of the economic and political development of the United States, is in his own day in 1932 claiming to blend together these things into a new narrative. It seems like he's also setting himself up to be the sort of perfect combination of the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian traditions of things. That is, he's Hamiltonian in method, but Jeffersonian in purpose. No.
Well, I mean, maybe. I need to know more about what you mean by Hamiltonian. I really think that for FDR, that it was, how do I take? It's really more about Wilson and TR. I think people underestimate or don't understand the depth of Theodore Roosevelt's commitment to the Republican tradition, the big R Republican Party tradition, in influencing his thought, and just how revolutionary Wilson was. So it's like he wanted to bring Wilson's understanding sort of back to the national level. I mean, and David can speak to this, but about the extent of government intervention in the economy and how successful it was in the First World War. But certainly, whatever its actual success during the First World War, certainly the perception was among the American people that the last time the government and the economy worked was during the First World War. So how do we recreate what the government did during the First World War during peacetime? So in many regards, I think what FDR was trying to do was recreate the feeling of the government control of the economy during the First World War, but somehow with the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt. And David can speak to that in more depth and precision than I can, probably.
Well, this might be a good opportunity to turn to the issue of the court packing scheme, which a question was asked about, and also will allow us to bring in TR, who actually had a far more radical proposal to overhaul the Supreme Court. But before doing so, I'd like to point out that in the Commonwealth Address, you see Roosevelt doing something that he was very good at throughout his presidency, and that's selective use of history. And his use of Jefferson is really quite clever and as you said, mostly accurate. But what Jefferson doesn't note in that statement about most of our laboring classes possess property is that actually no, most of the laborers didn't own property because they were property in 1776, and Roosevelt doesn't bring that up either.
It's not important.
Roosevelt's just trying to get elected in 32, so he's not going to go into full accurate history. I found his characterization of Wilson as a neo-Jeffersonian is rather bizarre and not accurate. But he's doing so to set up enlightened administration, right? Just as Roosevelt wanted to restrain the political system as a progressive, though he doesn't mention that, So too, Wilson wanted to restrain the financial system from doing harm to individual liberty. So that becomes Roosevelt's justification for calling Wilson a neo-Jeffersonian. But I think it's kind of just a clumsy segue out of his history lesson and into what he wants to do. And you mentioned at the start of our session, Stephen, the mood of emergency, and I think that bears reiteration because for Roosevelt and for Americans in 1932, the model for dealing with the Great Depression was what was done during World War I and the organizational state. During World War I, the United States government took over the operation of communications and transportation. The U.S. Railroad Administration was created, and at least privately owned railroads for the purposes of war mobilization. These were extraordinary expansions of federal power, and though they were temporary, Roosevelt can point to them, even if he's not being specific, and say, we've done this before to deal with an emergency. We can do that again now. And I think that's why in 37 he can feel comfortable enough to propose something as radical as the reconfiguration of the appointment of Supreme Court justices. I was teaching this last semester, and I outlined as simply as I could Roosevelt's proposal, and then I looked at my students who were all staring at me with looks of horror, and I said, this will be your final exam question. I said, I'm just kidding, because it's so hard to understand what the new Supreme Court would be based upon according to Roosevelt.
Well, of course, we know what he proposes, correct me if I'm wrong, is any justice over the age of 70 who refuses to step down, he gets to appoint an additional justice, right? Do I have the basics of it right?
Right. So up to 15 justices.
Up to 15 justices, yeah.
Right. And he says, we might just have 9, but we could go up to 15. And that's why it was called the court packing scheme. And when you look at that fireside address, he's insulted by that. He takes pains to explain, no, it's not a court packing scheme, as long as the old guys who don't agree with me get out of the way.
I'm sorry, it would only be packing if he were, as he says, trying to put people on the court who would agree with him and his policies. But that's not what he wants, because FDR is perfectly impartial. And
yeah,
right. And it would be impartial in appointing justices, and is impartial, he's not political. Apparently, I'm joking partly. But.
Right. Well, and he says, I don't, I propose them, but they have to be approved by the Senate, which is disingenuous, even to say it charitably, because even though Democratic majorities are shrinking at that time, and he does face opposition with his own party among conservative Southern Democrats, at that time, proposal of a Supreme Court justice by a president was basically confirmation. I mean, we don't have these drawn out fights over justices until very recent time. So when he says, they have to approve it, I mean, it's really a situation, everybody knows it, that it's going to go through.
Now, Billy asked in his group of questions that he submitted earlier, he posed the question this way: FDR's court packing scheme was the most grave threat to the separation of powers by any president. Agree or not? So what he's raising here is sort of an interesting constitutional question. He wants to know whether FDR's attempt to do this was a threat to separation of powers. And what I find interesting about that is Roosevelt, did he justify his court packing scheme as a way to preserve separation of powers? And interestingly enough, because one of his arguments was that the Supreme Court had become too powerful and in fact was legislating from the bench. Am I right about that? I mean, it is a confusing argument.
Well, and I would sort of disagree with the original question. With the greatest threat to the separation of powers is the rulemaking authority that's been that FDR kept asking for, that was being handed over to these administrative agencies, which were ultimately, a lot of it was struck down in the sick chicken case, Schechter Poultry, but it unleashes this unbelievable force, which is that every experiment creates a constituency, and it becomes this sort of undeniable logic that every well-meaning, and I do mean well-meaning, I'm a partisan myself, but I do know, I have a lot of friends who they do actually want to solve problems, but the problem is every time you use the administrative state to try and solve a problem, whether or not the problem gets solved or not, you've created a constituency. And the unleashing of that logic is a far greater threat to the separation of powers over the long term, I would say, than even the court packing scheme. David, I don't know how you feel about that.
I agree. I mean, I think the threat is what actually happens, not what does. And had the Roosevelt's proposal been followed through, I think we would be talking about it as a serious unbalancing of the federal system. His distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt actually had a far more radical proposal when he was running as a progressive independent candidate in the 1912 election. He proposed allowing the people of the United States in a national plebiscite to overturn Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, and there's a great speech by Taft, the incumbent president and former TR protege, expressing in wonderful Midwestern reticent, Taft from Ohio, absolute horror at this scheme, without using strident language. But Taft, who certainly knew the Constitution well, provides an extremely cogent argument dismissing Roosevelt's proposal as absolutely dangerous. So I think that's actually more radical than what Franklin Roosevelt proposes. But TR did it as a candidate, and he's not elected. Roosevelt is doing it as a president, and it was, as one of my students commented, it was, quote, an attempt at a, quote, hostile takeover of the judicial branch, end quote. I said I couldn't have said it better. I want to quote you on that, and I am.
But it was a political blunder, though, wasn't it? Historians pretty much concede on that. This hurt him a little bit.
Yeah.
I missed the last bit.
A political blunder?
He was reelected, but this was bad timing in a way too, right? I mean, it didn't help his opponents, and then in '38, he lost. Some of the more progressive candidates lost races, I believe, partly as a result of this. But yeah, no, this is very interesting.
The other thing, here's Chris, this just a complete aside that one of just because Dave brought up Taft. After Taft loses the election, he gives this series of lectures at Yale, I think, where he lays out his criticism of a lot of the underlying assumptions of progressivism. And boy, this guy could tell the future. I mean, it was like this in this series of lectures. He predicted everything that's happened over the past 100 years. It really is pretty incredible. Taft. The reason I don't assign that to my students is it's too hard to read. Taft is not a great writer. It writes in legalese, but the underlying ideas in those essays they were actually lectures that he delivered. But that would be something good to put on the Teaching American History site, is those, if you can track them down. I'm sure they're in his public papers.
Yeah, I know exactly. I've seen some of them, and I also assigned them, used to assign them in my course on the progressive era, and they are hard to read, so I pulled them. But this raises another interesting thing, because another interesting question, because Taft in his lectures, in his way he lays out his understanding of constitutional government, makes the argument that it's by respecting the proper separation of powers that the people actually somehow get to rule through their constitution. That seems to be a sort of an underlying theme that comes up from time to time. But Franklin Roosevelt, skipping back to Franklin Roosevelt, this is something students in my classes sometimes have to think very hard about, because there seems to be an irony here, in the sense that with Franklin Roosevelt, you have this massive shift in federal power, national power, and you have the growth of national agencies, regulatory agencies, and the power of the executive seems to grow. exponentially under Roosevelt. And at the same time, Roosevelt is constantly talking about defending what he calls the essence of democracy. So this is sometimes a tough thing to tackle, but how do you balance democracy with the kind of regulatory state that Roosevelt calls for and then helps to implement?
That is a great question, Chris. I think it gets to the heart of Roosevelt's governing philosophy. And we got this great question from Jennifer Spencieri about the Second Bill of Rights, and she asked, why does FDR's Second Bill of Rights never practically materialize? Is it owed most so to the economic boom of the post-World War II period, or is there more to it? I would actually argue that at almost every point Roosevelt called for in 1944 in a Second Bill of Rights has materialized, even if imperfectly, and certainly there's a lot of controversy surrounding them. But let's just look at a few of these points, and then I think this speaks to Roosevelt's belief you cannot have democracy unless you have regulation to get to this end, the means to an end, well-being. And that's why he says a Second Bill of Rights. You really aren't free unless you have the right to a good paying job, which is in a way an oblique reference to opportunity, right? But I think you could also argue that no, he's not just saying an opportunity that must be provided for you. The right to earn enough money to have the necessities of life. So minimum wage, federal minimum wage, parity for farmers, crop production payments begun during the New Deal continue today. Restraints on unfair business competition and monopolies, lots of laws on the books there. Medical care, adequate protection from poverty and old age, from sickness, accident, and unemployment exists today. A good education, lots of federal support for education there. So though it doesn't materialize on Roosevelt's watch, Truman picks right up with it. He delivers a speech in September of 1945, September 2nd, 1945, in which he calls for an economic Bill of Rights. It's just basically a repeat of what Roosevelt is talking about. And the Democratic Party, from Truman to Obama, is built upon a second Bill of Rights that requires a regulatory state and is justified in the name of having complete and whole democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but doesn't that require us to accept a relatively redefined understanding of democracy?
Right. I mean,
Well,
this is
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what I was kind of driving at with how FDR differed from Wilson. I mean, remember Wilson's approach in the New Freedom was, we're going to set up this system. It's going to be so perfect that we're going to set it up, and then we're just going to be able to walk away, and the system itself will be so perfect that it'll be like me, Wilson, God is the perfect watchmaker, right? It's only when he faces challenges from opponents that the rest of the New Freedom stuff comes in, that he didn't really believe that strongly in it, I don't think. FDR is different, right? He's trying to blend Theodore Roosevelt with Woodrow Wilson. And he says, no, we're going to have an administrative state, but it's going to be this is going to be the federal government. I mean, majoritarian democracy. The federal government is going to express the morality of the American people, right? That the government is going to be the expression of the enforcer of majoritarian prejudices, right? And we're going to use an administrative state to enforce the prejudices of the majority. Somebody also asked, like, would Thomas Jefferson approve? Because after all, he was an anti-federalist. Well, this is the ultimate anti-federalist policy in a way, right? That this is going to, we want a quote unquote, we want that the Constitution was a terrible idea, that that we want to go back to having the majority rule, the majority really rule, right? And that's what he would want. The other point that David broke up, about the nature of work. There's another thing that I always found interesting about FDR, and that is he always equated work with equality, not realizing, I think, just how diabolical or lazy human beings could become. Although I guess he did in one place. He always opposed a dole, right? And he said the dole is a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. So in that sense, FDR realized how important work was and why this stuff needed to be work related as opposed to just a dole.
Yes, right.
However, he didn't realize, I don't think, that he was unleashing these forces. Right? I mean, nobody spoke more eloquently than FDR about why you should never have public employee unions. Let the implications of that sink in for a while, right? You can't have a dole, and you cannot have public employee unions. So he did understand these. He felt like he was going to be the balancer of these things as the absorber and interpreter of the majoritarian and democratic spirit that would then be, spread throughout his administration.
Nice. Yeah, thank Stephen. By the way, you just touched on 2 or 3 really good questions that had been submitted, and I apologize I didn't earlier.
I was trying to.
I wanted to know about his views of Jefferson's presidency and also the parallels between Wilson's New Freedom, Wilson's policies during World War I, especially, and what Roosevelt was trying to do with the New Deal. I thought that was really useful. David, unless you have something to add to that, I thought what we do, we have about 15 minutes left, is maybe turn a little bit to Roosevelt's leadership in foreign policy.
I was going to suggest that, so yes, let's do that.
And it's kind of a shame that we've only left 15 minutes or so for that, but I think we all have a kind of similar understanding of what when we use the term statesman, we reserve the term statesman for special individuals who accomplish great things. Is it fair to refer to Roosevelt as a statesman with regard to how he handled the growing threat both before we entered the war and after we entered the war?
I would argue, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Stephen.
No, well, okay, I'll take this one first. You know who really influenced me on this question was another of our MAG faculty, Joseph Forneri, who really has this great concept of sophistry versus statesmanship. And I found it's a very useful construct. And to put it, that if you're, that what you want to do and what you look for in a statesman, I'm sure maybe Joseph would disagree with my characterization of his work, but if what you're really trying to do and what real leadership is what you want to try and encourage the better angels of people's natures, right? That you want to try and find the best version, because everyone is capable of being a bad human being. So what you want to do is you want to try and encourage the best version of everyone, and you try to encourage that. And what you might have to do is at different times emphasize different parts of your message, which can sometimes look dishonest, but it's statesmanship, not sophistry, if it is an emphasis on a different point when that emphasis is in the service of the truth. It becomes sophistry when you're doing that in the service of a lie. So I've always found, especially once we get into World War II, I said I rank FDR as our third greatest president, because I feel like in World War II, he was a true statesman. His leadership in World War II was I mean, I really can't give him high enough marks. For as bad as I find his, or flawed, I guess I would say, his economic policy during the New Deal, which a new study came out, by the way, that said that's trying to quantify the damage that that the New Deal did to the American economy. It was an interesting study. A couple of guys out of UCLA did it, some economists, but I find that his leadership in World War II was nothing short of miraculously good on the grander scale.
Especially when you think about the extent of, or just how sort of dug in isolationist sentiment seemed to be in the late 30s among very important people in government. How he managed to move us from that, or at least prepare us for when the moment came when we had to actually enter the war, I think is really remarkable.
I agree. If you start with the so-called quarantine speech of October 1937, which was not well received, Roosevelt lays out a fairly eloquent and what turns out to be a very consistent statement about the threat the Nazis, Nazi Germany, poses to the Western Hemisphere and to the United States specifically. And from 37 on, he's making that case again and again. We didn't talk about the Arsenal of Democracy speech very much, but there you see him offering that same statement, that's those same concerns that he had shared with the public and the world back in 1937. And in doing so, trying to undermine the isolationists, or as they preferred to be called, the non-interventionists. It's no problem. Well, in many ways they were isolationists, but they wanted to make it more specific. We're not trying to isolate ourselves. It's just this: we're not getting involved in that particular problem. And then once the war does bring the United States fully in, I mean, we should keep in mind the U.S. was in an undeclared state of war with Germany in the North Atlantic in the late summer of 1941 and through December of 1941 as a result of providing war essential supplies to Great Britain through Lend-Lease, which Roosevelt's calling for in that Arsenal of Democracy speech. And then throughout the war, I think he's very firm and unwavering in what the outcomes of the war must be. I mean, he really does stick to the Atlantic Charter. That creates all sorts of problems at the end of the war, and as a result of his sudden death with the Soviet Union. Somebody asked if Roosevelt had lived with through 45 and 46, would the Cold War have still happened? I believe yes, but I think the contours would have been different.
Yeah, I agree. Everything that you said. Something that Chris said, though, about the nature of isolationism just kind of jogged my memory, which is I sometimes want to re-emphasize. I know it's an old argument to a lot of professional historians, but to a lot of history teachers out there who might have had history teachers who were really old, it's important to re-emphasize that the 1920s was not a decade of isolationism. And I know that we all know that, but when I get together with a group of teachers, they still sometimes are teaching out of books that say that the 1920s were a time of isolationism. 1920s was not a time of isolationism. It was with the onset of the Depression that people began sort of circling the wagons and wanting to focus on national economic health. The other, so I would say that it's important to remind ourselves, and in this, I don't know how you feel, David, about, oh gosh, his name just escaped me, Walter McDougall. But he makes this case in Promised Land, Crusader State, that the longer American foreign policy tradition was unilateralism and American exceptionalism. It wasn't this sort of interventionism, isolationism. And I found that to be more useful than this sort of because if you start calling some of these people isolationists, you say, well, they aren't really isolationists. They're for unilateralism and American exceptionalism. And so FDR, bring it back to FDR, what I find compelling about his statesmanship was how he took this sort of core idea that people already had of unilateralism and American exceptionalism and shaped it into the Atlantic Charter, which was, again, this sort of, I think, kind of this, how do I absorb both all of these traditions and reform them into something that is qualitatively different, but that pays a certain amount of respect to, or it's almost like he can peel off some of those supporters. Does that make sense?
Yes.
By not entirely rejecting the arguments of the people who were not isolationists but were for unilateralism and American exceptionalism.
It's very interesting. It's very. I mean, it's hard for, I guess, a lot of us to just completely appreciate just how massive that undertaking is that Roosevelt, to move the American people more towards a willingness and openness, to intervene, to get involved when the time came. But sort of on a related note, Derek wants to get our thoughts or your thoughts on Roosevelt's, the Executive Order 9066, but Japanese internment. What was the rationale? This is a big subject, of course, right? We need another hour probably to cover this one, but what's the rationale and the impact of that?
Well, I'll tackle that first. The questioner, Derek, also asked what personal and political views might have shaped Roosevelt. And I've been thinking about that since I saw the question. And I think that Roosevelt didn't give the signing of 9066 much thought. I think he didn't fully appreciate the constitutional ramifications of it. I mean, talk about a mood of emergency. And in this case, as commander in chief, he's relying on information provided to him by his general on the spot, General John DeWitt, who we now know had misrepresented evidence of supposed sabotage activities on the part of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. In fact, he made them up, which swayed the Supreme Court to uphold the constitutionality of the internment in the Korematsu decision during the war. But I don't think Roosevelt, I think Roosevelt saw it in very black and white terms. We've been attacked. We've got an emergency. We need a military district set up. My generals are telling me this is what we need to do. We'll do it. There was internment of German aliens and Italian aliens in some cases, German Americans and Italian Americans who were born in the United States, so they were citizens. So there was some internment of them. In that case, it was more based upon individuals rather than targeting of a whole group. As I like to tell my students, if all people of German descent in one generation were rounded up during World War II, there would have been no one left to, go into D-Day or Normandy, because so many people are of German descent in the United States, and Italian too. So I just don't think he gave it a lot of thought. Stephen, what do you think?
Oh, I mean, yeah, in the broad strokes, you're right. I would only be adding to what you said. To him, it was a matter of military necessity, and I think one of the things that I credit FDR for, generally speaking, was not micromanaging his military leaders, and generally that served him well. The other person I would just mention, just to throw in there, would be Harry Stimson, who had been in Manchuria, and this probably affected how FDR was getting. I mean, that was FDR's Secretary of War, and he was actually in China when the Japanese had used Japanese residents in China in order to create the incident and sabotage leading to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So when you see something like that kind of firsthand, I think that affects you as Secretary of War. So the assumption was, and also, I mean, just to really take it back, remember our acquisition of Hawaii in the first place was defensive in nature because it had been part of Japanese policy to send settlers to Hawaii, and before, and that was really what pushed our hand to acquire it as a territory. So keeping those two things in mind, it makes it a little bit, so, factor in, all right, the history of this territory is the reason we even have it as a territory is that we know that Japanese really want it. And we know that the settlers were specifically sent there by the Japanese government. And we also know that in other places, what the Japanese have done was use the local population in order to sabotage or create incidents, and that would then be followed by an invasion. So it isn't completely crazy in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, where, by the way, our entire West Coast was defenseless. For FDR to, issue the order to intern the Japanese, which did also arouse quite a bit of controversy immediately. I mean, the legal case started almost immediately to get them out. And, if it weren't for Joe DiMaggio's mother, and this is, if you want, any of you want a good book on baseball during the Great Depression, Charles Alexander has a book called Breaking the Slump on baseball during the Depression. But if it wasn't for Joe DiMaggio's mother being an illegal Italian alien, the Italians probably, the rounding up of Italians probably would have continued as well. So I guess I understand the context of it more. The Chris had asked about the impact of it. The impact of it, that has more to do with the later times than what it was like at the time.
Was it widely disapproved of by, let's say, non-Japanese Americans?
No.
It was pretty widely accepted.
Yeah, the only people who disapproved of it, I'm overstating it for shock value, were the people who wanted them killed. I mean, you had all these incidents, and most of them are recounted in books about free shaves for Japs and stuff like that, and Jap hunting licenses being issued in Colorado and all this stuff. So, it's hard to overstate the anti-Japanese feeling the day after Pearl Harbor.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks for that. We're just about out of time, so I hesitate to bring this up at the end, but I thought maybe as a way to get your last thoughts, for now anyway, and maybe tie some things together. One thing I found interesting, especially in the 1944 State of the Union address, as Roosevelt is managing the war effort, and from the sounds of what you're saying, both of you think that he did a pretty good job of that, and I agree. But he's also, it seems like especially in this address, he's using. Man, I don't want to say this the wrong way. He is, even in the midst of war, he is reminding Americans of his vision of a better domestic society, or a better. He's reminding Americans of that sort of vision of a society of equality and fairness and all these other sorts of things that we talked about earlier in our discussion back in the New Deal. So one of the lines that always sticks out to me in the 1944 State of the Union address is it's kind of toward the end, where he says, "It's our duty now to begin to lay the plans and determine the strategy for the winning of a lasting peace and the establishment of an American standard of living higher than ever before. We cannot be content, no matter how high that general standard of living may be, if some fraction of our people is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and ill-secured." And then, of course, he goes on and lays out his second Bill of Rights. But so even in the midst of war, of course, this is 44, right in the thick of things. Even in the middle of war, Roosevelt is reminding Americans of that vision of that equality, that society founded on fairness and equality, that was so central to his New Deal thinking. So I always just find that remarkable. That what that reminds me of is, well, it suggests to me that victory for Roosevelt is not simply defeating fascism abroad, as he says in the speech. We've also got to defeat the spirit of fascism here at home. I'm not sure who he directs that toward, what that means. Do you have any thoughts on any of that? Or any other last thoughts as we wrap things up?
Just two quick thoughts based upon that 1944 speech. One, it's a campaign speech in many ways, since Roosevelt will run for an unprecedented fourth term later that year, and so he's got to provide a pretty strong rationale for doing so. He's already broken the two-term tradition, but continuing his streak, so to speak, I think required added justification. So not just well, we can't change horses now before the war's over, but also what we need to continue to do after the war. And I think also we can bring it back to his Four Freedoms speech on the eve of U.S. entry into the war. Here, Roosevelt in that 44 speech is specifying what must be done by the federal government under his leadership, presumably with Congress helping, to fulfill those four freedoms. And I think that mention of fascists at home is a dig at his political enemies and opponents and those who are becoming ever more critical of the New Deal and hoping that the post-war era would bring circumstances that would allow rollback of the New Deal. It's interesting to note that with that line, Roosevelt echoes A. Philip Randolph. Someone asked the question about EO 8802 and Roosevelt's setting up of the Fair Employment Practice Committee and requiring non-discrimination in defense plants. A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, had called for this mass march in Washington and said, invoked the Double V campaign, victory over Hitlerism abroad, victory over Hitlerism at home, meaning racism. And so here's Roosevelt, who was reluctant to sign that order, but did so because he was under pressure. He didn't want to march in Washington by African Americans. But then he's using that same sort of rhetoric. We're beating the fascists at home, but then we've got some of them at home as well, whether that's a fair criticism or not.
Amazing. That really helps explain the context of the speech and gives new meaning of it to me. So I'm going to go back and reread it in that context.
And it was, I would also say Truman picks up on this quite a bit. I mean, if you go back and look at all those "Give 'em hell, Harry" speeches from 1948, he's always accusing his opponents of being fascists. I mean, the Republicans are Nazis. He flat out says that the Republicans are trying to take over this government like the Nazis took over in Germany. And he said it in speech after speech after speech in 48. I mean, we all think it's cute, oh yeah, give them hell. Go back and actually read those speeches. They were pretty over the top.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing I noticed, Stephen, you remind me, Roosevelt does use the language of warfare even before, the 1940s. He's using the language of warfare to describe, sort of the urgency of his domestic policies, and he's always asking his fellow Americans to wage war on things. And I suppose once you start introducing that language, it's an easy step into characterizing your political and economic opponents as enemies.
I'm sure some historians should do this, but look at when politicians started using the language of war to describe their policy goals. Because when you're calling for war, I mean, this is why everybody wants a war on things, but why the war on these things never exists? Because there's nothing like war. War is war, right? The violence and death are fundamentally different than anything else in the human experience. So when you have politicians calling for wars on things, but it does harken back to what I said earlier of he was trying to recreate the sort of spirit of the First World War. And I think that explains a lot of the rhetoric. How do we recreate the conditions of what we did in World War I for this war effort, but on an economic front? And then once the actual war has started, how do we retain the spirit of war in order to accomplish the things that we would like to accomplish once the war is over?
That is a great point. That's a great point. I hadn't thought of that before. And I hadn't thought of a lot of things that came up in our conversation today. So we've gone over a little bit. Thanks very much for staying with us a few extra minutes. It was well worth it. I've learned a great deal today, and I thank you both for being with us. So hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, anytime. I just got to get my in-laws to take the kids and reserve my laundry room. And
Thanks, Chris. This has been a lot of fun. The time just flew by.
Yeah.
I learned a great deal, and it was very, very interesting. And I hope our folks joining us this morning also enjoyed it and learned some things in the conversation.
Good questions too.
Yeah, great questions today. Those were
Yeah,
very
thanks everybody for great questions.
helpful. Sorry to those that I didn't get to, or we didn't get to, but I thought the questions were really good. So I just want to remind people joining us that you will receive an email with a link to get a certificate of participation. Our next webinar will be on Saturday, March 5th, same time, 11 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be on Dwight Eisenhower, Change at Home and Challenge Abroad. And I'll be joined by Joseph Postel of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and David Alvis of Wofford College. So the readings for that webinar have already been posted on TAH.org, and I hope to see you all then. Until then, take care. Thanks again, Stephen and David. That was